Hello, I hope that this class recording finds you doing well and having a beautiful and relaxing day. For this week's conversation, we're going to be looking at physical abuse, and I must admit, it seems almost common sense that we would understand and recognize this as being traumatic or traumatizing for a child. We're going to be looking at physical abuse and transition some to looking at sexual abuse, because there are some definitions that are specifically related to sexual abuse and sexual assault as it pertains to children. And so I do want to just caution you and prepare you that some of what we'll be discussing is graphic in nature, but also very important for you to be aware of and to know about as you're providing support for children affected by illness and injury in the healthcare setting. Because unfortunately, in this day and time and in the world that we live in, this does exist and this does happen and take place. And we want to be in the position to be able to identify red flags and to intervene if necessary when we observe something that just seems a little bit off, or that we have concerns about, or if we see violence against children take place in front of us. So we are going to look at physical abuse, and I do want to say, with even as difficult as it is to see it, it's something that I hope I never understand, because I think if I do understand how someone can perpetrate violence against children, that if it ever comes to that point in time where I understand it, then I need to be concerned that I would understand why someone would make that choice. But again, we know that the world is broken and it's hurting, and that there are a lot of different factors that contribute to someone perpetrating violence against children, and that's why we need a savior, and that's why we want to be the hands and feet of Jesus when working with children and families. So every child does deserve to grow up in a nurturing environment where they're loved, cared for, secure, and protected from verbal, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse, exploitation, and neglect. When we're talking about child abuse, what we're talking about is any intentional act against a child that is under 18 years old, and that's considered to be child abuse. In many cases, child abuse is done by someone that the child knows and trusts. And most commonly, it's a parent or another relative. So it's not some stranger, some remote individual that just happens to come across the child. In most cases, it is someone that's very close and near and dear to the child's heart, someone in their close proximity and in their environment, someone that knows them and is responsible for their needs, their basic needs, and making sure that those needs are met. Every year, more than 3.6 million children are made to, referrals are made to child protection agencies. So what this means is that every year, more than 3.6 calls are made to Child Protective Services, Department of Children and Family Services, Department of Children, where there are concerns about the child's physical well-being. A referral can include multiple children, especially if there are siblings, if there are extended family members living in the home. And so these tend to involve more than 6.6 million children. The United States has one of the worst records amongst industrialized nations, losing on average between 4 and 7 children every day, losing meaning child fatalities, deaths of between 4 and 7 children every day to child abuse and neglect, which is just unfathomable to consider that this amount of children are dying on a daily basis as a result of violence that's perpetrated against them by someone that's supposed to love and care for them and protect them. A report of child abuse is made every 10 seconds. Now, the implications and the effects of child abuse on society are staggering. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention link adverse childhood experiences, again, those ACEs. And again, just remember that these can also include other dysfunctions besides abuse and neglect in the home, with a range of long-term health impacts. In that for the individual that survives these ACEs, these traumatic experiences, this abuse and neglect, that they are more likely, 6 times more likely, they have an average life expectancy that's 2 decades shorter than those who reported none. So those that have experienced adverse childhood experiences, which include child abuse and neglect, have 20 years shorter life expectancy than someone that hasn't had any type of adverse childhood experience. Some of the health-related conditions that we see as effects of childhood child abuse and neglect include heart disease, pulmonary disease, liver disease, and other health-related quality of life issues. So it might be obesity, it might be asthma, it may be cancer because of internalizing feelings associated with the experiences that they have had. Physical child abuse occurs when a child is purposely, again, intentionally physically injured or put at risk of harm by another person, someone that's responsible for that child's care. Now, what's important to note is that you're going to want to make sure that you're familiar with the different legislation that are associated with protecting children against child abuse and neglect. You're going to want to make sure that you're familiar with your state's laws as well as your hospitals' policies and procedures, because there are some differences in definitions and in laws between states, and also expectations in terms of roles and responsibilities and who the process of calling and making a report. So physical abuse signs and symptoms include unexplained injuries like bruises or fractures that don't really line up with the history given to the physician. So if the mechanism of injury does not match the type of injury the child has, then the doctor is going to question that. So what that means is that the type of fracture or injury that the child has doesn't, again, line up with the explanation given by the adults. And so those would be red flags to the doctor and other healthcare staff members to be aware that something's not plausible, something's not accurate in the story that's being given. And then injuries, again, that don't match the given explanation. Some of the behavioral indicators that we will see in children that have experienced physical abuse include withdrawal from friends or usual activities. This is oftentimes them withdrawing from social interaction, withdrawing from activities that they normally would enjoy or want to participate in, but for whatever reason are withdrawing from without any explanation. They may also have some other changes in behavior, which can include aggression or anger and hostility, because they have all these feelings they don't really know what to do with and where to place them and how to express them in an appropriate way because of what's been observed for them in the home. And because, again, as we know with trauma, that the more traumas that an individual has experienced, that it has the potential to affect them developmentally and also change the brain structure. And this has the potential then to impact their ability to regulate emotions and impulsivity in their behaviors. And so we may see it manifested in aggression or anger and hostility toward others. Or again, as we've talked about in previous weeks, that hyperactivity, when I referenced the Nadine Burke-Harris YouTube video and in her conversation about the children that she was seeing in her clinical practice, that oftentimes she was they were being referred to her for attention deficit hyperactivity. And when she started to explore further, what she identified was that these children were all experiencing trauma and that they were processing and that it was affecting them in what might appear to be hyperactivity, ADHD type symptomology, but it was really the heart of the matter was the trauma that they experienced. Children were also inclined or are also inclined to suffer from depression or anxiety or unusual fears. The depression may be feelings that they have about themselves, about their situation, about lack of hope for change of their circumstance, and anxiety or unusual fears because of their experience and their likelihood of them feeling as though they have to live on eggshells, or if you start to witness a sudden loss of self-confidence where it just seems like, who must be telling them these things about themselves that would cause them to question themselves, then you would want to kind of red flag that. If there's an apparent lack of supervision, and if the adults don't really seem to be aware of the child's presence, where they're at, what they're doing, who they're with, if there are frequent absences from school that are unexplained, is this because the parents don't want to be bothered, or the perpetrator doesn't want to be bothered with taking the child to school, or is it because the child is injured and the perpetrator doesn't want the school to be able to identify that? Reluctance to leave school activities. If you have a child that is doing anything that they can to stay at school and to try to avoid going home, that would be a red indicator, a red flag that you might want to say, okay, why is it that they're not wanting to go home? What is it about the home that is causing them not to want to leave school to go there? If they're running away, if the child is attempting to run away or is talking about running away, telling their friends that they want to run away, then this would also be another indicator. If they're engaging in self-harm or attempts at suicide because they feel no hope and they don't feel like their circumstances are ever going to change and that this is the only out, then we're going to red flag that. That's going to speak volumes to us. And then if they're engaging in rebellious or defiant behavior, again, this has to do with the ability to regulate emotions and impulsivity and increased behaviors that are risky because of the effects of the trauma on the brain. So they may as well engage in defiant behavior. In one particular study, 80% of 21-year-olds who reported childhood abuse met the criteria for at least one psychological disorder, if not more, which is huge. 80% of 21-year-olds who experienced child abuse as a child met the criteria for a psychological disorder. And we know that mental health services are not what they need to be in this country. So what does this then mean for these individuals and for our society? And what are the far-reaching effects of experiencing this abuse and neglect, which again lends voice to the need to intervene when we see something happening or if we suspect something happening. Some of the parental behaviors that we see when there is a caregiver that is perpetrating violence against the child, they show little concern for the child's well-being. They're not really concerned about them. They're unable to recognize if the child is in distress, if the child is crying, if they're hurting for whatever reason. That caregiver is unable to identify that, and they're not sensitive to that. They don't respond to it, or they blame the child for whatever problems that they're experiencing. And I believe I've shared this example with you before, but again, just to use it to illustrate this point, the example that I have shared about the mom's boyfriend who I was in the intensive care unit and I got called to the waiting area and they said, there's a man there with 2 children and he brought a 3rd child in. She's in the operating room right now. And can you go and provide support for this family? So I went, and the police officers were talking to the man. And so I went and looked for the children, but they had already been taken away from the hospital. I don't know if it was a family member or DCFS at that point, but they ended up arresting the boyfriend because what he had been doing is perpetrating violence against this 2-year-old, and she had subdural hematomas and retinal hemorrhaging, and they had to relieve the pressure on the brain, so they took her to the OR. And what we learned is that he had been soliciting and eliciting the siblings in the abuse of this child, that he had been telling the older siblings, the reason we can't go out to a restaurant to eat is because your sister doesn't behave, and because your sister won't listen and runs all over the place, then, we can't go to Chuck E. Cheese's. And so he actually encouraged them to pinch her and bite her and hit her too, to blame that particular child, scapegoat that particular child for the family's problems, which again, thinking about the trauma for those siblings too, not wanting to be the focus of the abuse themselves, but at the same time, now they're being brainwashed to look at their sibling in this way, and they're perpetrating violence against their younger sibling. So just a lot of dysfunction and need for additional support for that family. He ended up being arrested, and mom ended up coming in later that day to see the little one, and I had the opportunity to meet her. Just very interesting family dynamics. If the parent is consistently belittling or berating the child, and describing them as being worthless. No one's ever going to love you, no one's ever going to want you, or you're evil. If that individual limits the child's contact with others for fear that they may see some of the bruises, some of the physical injuries, and that the child may disclose the abuse. And so they severely limit their ability to engage or to spill the beans, so to speak. They expect the child to provide them with attention and care. So where the child is almost parentified, and where the parent expects that the child should act like a parent and care about them only and meet the parent's needs. And if that individual is jealous of other family members, getting attention from the child because they want that child only to meet their need. If they engage in harsh physical discipline in front of us, we have to ask ourselves, what are they doing behind closed doors? And then if they have unrealistic expectations of the child based on where that child is at developmentally, or an inappropriate level of expectation in terms of academic performance, that would also be a red flag. Again, and if the mechanism of injury, the history, it doesn't align with the child's injuries. So if there's conflicting or unconvincing explanations. Some of the risk factors for the adult being a perpetrator include whether the adult has a history of being abused or neglected as a child, him or herself, if there is a history of mental health issues, including depression or PTSD because of their early childhood or things that they've experienced, if the family has experienced a recent family crisis or stress, and this can include loss of job, change of home, loss of home, domestic violence, if there are other marital conflicts, or if the parent is a single parent, these are going to increase the chances or likelihood. These are risk factors that contribute. If the child is developmentally or physically disabled or has a medical condition, this is another risk factor. If the child is 3 and under, this is another risk factor because they're not able to verbalize what's happening to them, and because oftentimes these are the children that may still be at home and not yet, although of course not in every case, but they may still be at home and not yet in the school system. Again, we know that some of these children may be in daycare settings too, so it's not to discount that, but some children are still at home, 3 and under, and so this is an additional risk factor. If there's social or extended family isolation, they don't have social supports, they don't have family supports when they're frustrated, and they don't have anyone to help them and they're having to do it on their own or feel that they have to do it on their own. If there's a loss of job, if there's a medical condition that would increase financial stress on the family, if there's a recent layoff in the family, poverty, all of these are risk factors. Again, that poor understanding of child development, so having unrealistic expectations for behaviors and for performance, are all going to increase this risk. And then if the parent has substance use issues. Some of the physical issues that we see in the child as a result of experiencing child abuse and neglect include premature death, so fatalities associated with their abuse and neglect, physical disabilities as a result of their injuries, and learning disabilities as a result of their injuries. If there's a traumatic brain injury, the repeated exposure to trauma and to stress, changing the brain structure and causing developmental delays, these are going to contribute to learning disabilities in the child. And for the child to cope with their experiences, they may use substances to numb themselves from their feelings and from their experiences. And the further reaching, the long-term effects of child abuse on the child include health problems, heart disease, immune disorders, chronic lung disease, and cancer. So if you look at the literature pertaining to child abuse and neglect, and you pull up the literature and you enter a second search engine, second search term, and you put illness and injury, then you'll see some of these statistics. Some of the behavioral issues, again, that we'll see in the child that's experienced abuse and neglect include delinquent or violent behavior, again, because of the ability to regulate emotions, impulsivity, risk-taking behaviors, feelings of aggression, and what they've seen modeled for them. It's understandable that we would see this. Again, now these are generalizations. There are always deviances, right? So we know that there's some children that overcome these challenges and don't necessarily always exhibit these behaviors, but that there's an increased likelihood that we'll see these behaviors in a child that's experienced abuse and neglect. They may also abuse others. They may, as I've mentioned before, withdraw from interactions from others. It's not uncommon for them to attempt suicide or self-injury, for them to engage in high-risk behaviors that include teen pregnancy, substance use. Again, those risky behaviors because of the way that their brain's been changed, and because their experience with the world and the way that they view the world has been skewed by their experiences, and because they're also looking for affection and to have their basic needs met in some way. And so what's normal to them is going to, in most cases, going to be very hopefully abnormal to what the common experience is. And so it's helping to retrain the brain from the experiences that they've had to a healthy new normal. And so that can be quite the challenge because of what they've experienced. They may exhibit problems in school or not finishing high school. And then because of limitations in their interactions with others, they may have limited social and relationship skills. Again, we always talk about how when there's a challenge to those early attachment relationships, that primary caregiver attachment, those that are intended to meet the basic needs of the child, that this has the potential then to shape the way that the child views the world and others, and sees the world then as dangerous and as relationships as dangerous. And this is going to influence the way that they interact with others and develop relationships with others. And so as a result, they're going to have limited social and relational skills. And then they may have problems with work or staying employed, which may relate to cognitive challenges associated with the abuse, being in that hyperarousal state, challenges in impulsivity and regulating emotions, and staying focused and on task. And so they may have problems with work or staying employed. Some of the emotional issues that we see are low self-esteem because of the physical abuse and their feelings about themselves, if they're being told that they're worthless as they're being beaten, if they don't feel as though they can contribute, if someone has told them they're not smart or that they're not going to amount to anything, then they're going to understandably have very low self-esteem. So doing what we can to encourage and to identify strengths and to emphasize how brave they are for what they've experienced and how strong they are for making it through it. So we want to do what we can, again, to promote and to foster, to identify strengths and come from that strengths-based approach. They're going to, again, have difficulty with relationships, to intimacy and trust of other individuals because of fear that they're going to end up just like their home life, their home experience. They can also have an unhealthy view of parenthood because of what they've experienced, which is why intervention and mental health services and counseling is going to be so important. Again, because of changes to the brain and changes to the brain affecting their ability to regulate, they may have a difficult time with coping with stress and with frustrations. And because of what they've witnessed in terms of, if you think about Bandura's social learning theory again, they may believe that violence is common and that this is the norm for everyone's household. And so they may have an acceptance that violence is a normal part of relationships. So they come to expect it, even though we know that that's a picture of an unhealthy relationship. Some of the mental health disorders that we might see in a child that has experienced abuse and neglect include eating disorders, such as bulimia or anorexia. If I starve myself, then maybe I'll die and I won't have to deal with this anymore. Or if there's also sexual abuse coupled with this, bulimia, and that I'm going to make myself so unattractive that they'll leave me alone, they won't want me, they won't bother me, or eating for comfort. Personality disorders, oppositional defiant, borderline personality disorder, because of their experiences, it can manifest in different ways. It can also include like reactive attachment disorder, behavior disorders, acting out, I guess, again, impulsivity, feelings of depression, anxiety because of always being in that hyper state of arousal, being prepared for that next blow or when that person's going to fly off the handle next. So it's understandable that they would exhibit some of these conditions as a result of what they've experienced. So again, we want to be sensitive and take the context into account and reserve and avoid judgment. So always be thinking about our patients with not that unconditional positive regard, because we don't know what their life has been and we don't know what they've experienced and what's happened to them before they come to us in the hospital setting and they're going to go home. We have a very small snapshot of what their everyday life looks like. So doing what we can to support. Sleep disturbances, again, challenges to falling asleep because you're afraid that that person could come in at any moment and get violent. Or when I fall asleep, all I relive in my dreams and my nightmares are that last beating. And then, as I mentioned, attachment disorders. It's so important that if we have suspicions or we suspect that something is happening, that we say something. Again, we're not investigators. Our role is simply to do what we can to support the child. And if we see that that child is at risk or there's a potential for harm, then again, it's our role as mandated reporters to make the report. It's not our role to investigate or to interview. It's to be that emotional support, to listen, to let that child just be a child if they don't want to talk about it and they just need that opportunity to be in a safe place to play and be comfortable and let their guard down, that we do that for them. If there's an opportunity to provide preparation and it's in alignment with the hospital's policies and procedures, that we provide preparation and support as the exams are taking place, again, taking into consideration that child's need and right to privacy and not have, multiple people observing as though they're up for display, being very respectful and mindful of that, but doing what we can to provide that emotional support for the child. So we must learn to recognize early signs of abuse and neglect in order to help save the 5 children that die every day from child abuse and neglect. Again, our role in the hospital really is to provide that psychosocial and emotional support. It might be just providing an activity for the child and the sibling while mom steps out of the room and talks with the police officer, or dad steps out of the room and talks to the police officer. It might also include providing preparation for that exam. Again, our role is not to investigate, and so we don't want to ask questions. We want to listen, and depending on our interaction, we want to make sure that we document everything in the child's words and that we observed in the medical record. You want to be detailed so that way if medical records are subpoenaed, they have the information that they need in the medical record. Now, what's interesting is that one of the most recent bulletin articles for the ACLP includes an article on medical documentation being subpoenaed. So I encourage you to take a look at that article. I think it will be helpful for you. But understanding that we are not in a role of investigating and we don't want to ask questions that could potentially be misconstrued as leading the conversation, because that could be the line between that perpetrator being held accountable and prosecuted and having to let that person go because we've unintentionally done something that's planted a seed of doubt in the minds of those juries. And so we want to be very careful in our interactions, but be available to provide that support and provide that opportunity for that child to just be a child. And unfortunately, a child that's had something really horrible happen to him or her. In 2014, state agencies identified an estimated 1,580 children who died as a result of abuse and neglect. So again, this is between 4 and 5 children a day. Now, we also know that the statistics are not truly indicative of the problem because these are just the cases that we know about. We know that there are a lot of cases that go unreported and that are where the perpetrator is not held accountable or where the child remains in the home. And so we also know that for medical documentation, when a death has occurred, that there are times where the cause of death may not necessarily be listed as physical abuse. however that may have been the cause of the death. And so this is all going to potentially then skew the data and skew the statistics that we have. So studies, as I mentioned, also indicate that there's a significant undercounting of child maltreatment fatalities by state agencies by at least 50% or more. So more than 70% of the children who died as a result of child abuse or neglect were 2 years of age or younger, as I mentioned, because they're nonverbal. They don't have the vocabulary to be able to state what's happening to them. More than 80% were not old enough for kindergarten. Again, as I mentioned, many are still in the home, and so they're not in an academic setting where there would be other adults that could be observant and pinpoint or, identify those red flags, which again is very scary, for these children that don't have someone or that have limited ability for someone to intervene and intervene on their behalf. Around 80% of children maltreatment fatalities involve at least one parent as the perpetrator. Now, with all of this being said, there are things that we can do. We can identify the red flags when we see them. If we suspect, can make a report. As mandated reporters, we are required by law to make a report. It's not for us to investigate. And our employers, it's against the law for them to prevent us or to say that they're going to fire us from making a report if we have a suspicion. We are protected under the law that if we in good faith have a suspicion and make a report, that we are protected by law from any type of retribution. Now, as mandated reporters, when we make a call, we want to state that we are a mandated reporter because that tends to carry more weight than if we just call to say that we're, some random person calling anonymously. And so if you are calling in a professional capacity, that means in your professional role as child life specialist working with children, then you do want to indicate that you're a mandated reporter. We also want to do what we can to support families, understanding that there are a lot of different factors that contribute to an individual perpetrating violence against children, and that there are certain interventions that can be used to decrease the likelihood of child abuse occurring that can be supportive of the family. So we want to do what we can to promote nurturing bonds between children, parents, and caregivers. Again, identifying the strengths of the family so that we can do what we can to promote and build on those strengths. We want to connect them with community resources. So ensuring effective, appropriate, and research-based child discipline. So again, this goes back to providing education regarding child development and appropriate expectations and ways of providing positive guidance and redirection for the child. Strengthening parental resilience to stress. So helping them to develop different coping strategies and coping techniques to use, and identifying the resources to use when they feel themselves becoming stressed and their anger heightened. We also want to do what we can to develop emotional and social skills in children so that they can develop their support systems and their social relationships so that they have individuals that they can reach out to when they're scared, when they're hurting, when something's happening. We want to support parents through social connections, again, to families and friends, and identify community resources, so providing those community resource referrals so you get them connected to the resources that are going to be most helpful for them. Do you have any questions about this piece before we transition to the discussion on sexual abuse? If you do, please don't hesitate to reach out. Let me know. Feel free to send a text message, to send an email. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. And these are just a couple of resources for you. And now we're going to switch gears to our sexual abuse slide. Okay, so when we're talking about sexual abuse, we want to first become aware of the prevalence and how relevant it is, how much of a social problem it is in our society now. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Children's Bureau reports that child maltreatment found that 9.2% of victimized children were sexually assaulted. So the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Children's Bureau, in their 2010 child maltreatment report, found that 9.2 children were sexually assaulted. 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 20 boys is a victim of child sexual abuse. So if you think about if you've ever worked in a daycare classroom, or if you've ever been a teacher's assistant in a classroom setting or in a daycare, and you look around at the amount of children in your care, 1 in 5 and 1 in 20 have been a victim of child sexual abuse. Self-report studies show that 20% of adult females and 5 to 10% of adult males can recall a childhood sexual assault or abuse incident. And during a 1-year period in the United States, 16% of youth ages 14 to 17 had been sexually victimized, and over the course of an individual's lifetime, 28% of the United States youth between 14 and 17 had also been sexually victimized. Children are most vulnerable to child sexual abuse between the ages of 7 and 13. Children who don't live with both parents, as well as children living in homes marked by parental dissatisfaction or discord, where there's been a divorce or domestic violence, have a higher risk of being sexually abused. So we talk about those risk factors, and that would include what we see here. If there's marital dysfunction, if there's divorce in a single parent household, if there's a new boyfriend that's not biologically related to the child, if there's domestic violence happening, these are all going to contribute and are going to be risk factors that contribute to the likelihood of a child being sexually abused. When we're talking about child sexual abuse, what we're talking about is any child under the age of 18 years, unless they're legally emancipated. A sexually abused child means a child whose parent or caretaker, regardless of the relationship, that commits or allows to be committed any sexual offense against that child. And you're going to want to make sure that you refer to the criminal code for your state, because laws change and laws are different state by state. And so you're going to want to be aware of what is legal and what the definitions are in your state to make sure that you're aware of them, and so that when you hear doctors and nurses talking about these, that you're familiar with them and you know what they're referring to. Or any individual that exploits or allows exploitation of a child for the gratification or profit of an adult, and this can include production of pornographic materials. Sexual abuse means activities with a minor under the age of 18 that include exhibitionism, fondling, penetration, or intercourse. Sexual assault means the act of a person 17 years of age or older who commits an act of sexual penetration with a victim who is under 13 years. So you've got the legal definition of sexual abuse, which means any activities with a minor under the age of 18 that include exhibitionism, fondling, penetration, or intercourse. And sexual assault is where you have an individual over 18 who commits a sexual penetration with a victim who's under 13 years of age when the act was committed which caused great bodily harm to the victim or resulted in permanent disability or was life-threatening. Sexual penetration. Now, these are all terms, legal terms that are specifically associated with sexual abuse of children. So that's the reason why I'm giving you, these legal definitions, because they're specifically related to acts against children, sexual acts against children. Sexual penetration means any contact between the sex organ or anus of one person by an object, the sex organ, mouth, or anus of another person, or any intrusion, however slight, or any part of the body of one person or of any animal or object into the sex organ or anus of another person, including cunnilingus, fellatio, or anal penetration. Now, emission of semen is not required to prove penetration. Okay, so those are just some of the terms associated with child sexual abuse. Now, if a child presents to the hospital and the doctor is meeting with the family and the family is giving information to the doctor, the history that the family gives to the doctor is going to be suspect. So it's going to be questioned or questionable if there are unexplained histories to the child, if the history given or the explanation given changes depending on who's asking the questions, and if the explanation is inconsistent, if there are discrepancies in the history, if there are histories that the parents or family is giving that blame a third person, if the family gives a history that reports that the child did it to him or herself, if the histories don't adequately explain the injuries or the extent of the injuries, if the adult has delayed in seeking care for more than 24 hours, if the parent is not concerned about the child's injuries or well-being, if you see that there's an unrelated adult seeking medical care for the child, that is going to be a huge red flag. I'm going to focus on the first three columns of this. The last is more so related to different diagnoses that the doctors would be a little bit more looking for, but I've included in here just so that you can take a look at it and be aware of them, but I'm not necessarily going to focus as much on the differential diagnosis part. The behavior of the caregiver towards the child, if they're aggressive, hostile, or they're evasive of questions, if they're not concerned with the distress that the child is experiencing, if they're apathetic or unresponsive, or conversely, the opposite of this, if they're overly concerned about the child, if they're also overwhelmed by the problems of life. If just, oh, this is just one more thing, and we just got done having this and this and this happen, if they're just very overwhelmed, or if they're overly concerned, oh my gosh, like, what are you doing this for? And, I've already told you, and, I don't want you to have to examine them. I've already told you what happened. And, or if they're just like, oh, what is this for? And what is that for? Why are you doing this to them now? Then you're going to kind of be wondering what else is going on. Again, understanding that there's an appropriate level of concern that we would expect our families to have and that we would want them to have in caring for their child. But if you just think that it's just a little over the top, then you're going to want to probe a little bit further. Some of the behaviors of the child that we might see include the child being very shy or withdrawn or provocative. I know I often give the example in my face-to-face classes of where I had a 4-year-old that presented to the hospital for a medical condition, but she had a lot of psychosocial factors, a lot of risk factors in the home. Mom was a single parent. Mom had some substance use issues, and there were some instances where mom had left her in the care of unknown individuals for extended periods of time. But this little girl, she's 4, and she would pull her hospital gown off her shoulder and would walk down the hall as if she were modeling clothes. Yeah, it may not necessarily seem like that out of character or little girls, or she may have just seen it on TV if her mom watched modeling. Like, there are lots of different reasons, but with this particular little girl, the way that she was carrying herself, there were a lot of red flags. There were times that she would walk up to random strangers and grab them by the hand and ask if she could go home with them, which goes into that indiscriminate attachment. And so it's not uncommon with children who have experienced sexual abuse to have not had consistent caregiving and not had their basic needs met. And so because they're trying to find a way to have their basic needs met, their need for food, for care, for affection, that they'll try to find a way to get it any way that they can. And so this little girl had indiscriminate attachment. She was just going up to random strangers, grabbing them by the hand, wanting to sit in their lap, wanting to go home with them. And so there were a lot of red flags here. It's also, again, not uncommon for there to be speech or sleep eating disorders. Child reports the abuse, but maybe is using terms that are unfamiliar to the adult, because there are different terms that those that groom children, perpetrators that groom children for sexual abuse might use that we may not necessarily always identify, which is why we always try to encourage parents to use concrete terms and actual terms so that it's very clear if something is happening and that child is familiar with the appropriate terms for the body. If the child is overly compliant because they're wanting to please the adults, or if they're engaging in self-destructive behaviors, that's also going to be a red flag. Or if they're just totally flat affect, if they are showing an absence of emotions, if they appear numb, then these would also be indicators or an indicator. Some of the physical indicators of sexual abuse that we might see can include torn or bloody underclothing, pain, swelling, or itching of genitals in the genital area, pain when urinating, or discharge from the vagina or penis, or if the child has been diagnosed with a sexually transmitted disease. We want to do what we can. The reason why I share all this information with you is that we want to do what we can to be aware of the signs and symptoms. Not that we're going to necessarily be looking for them, but if we identify behaviors and see things, we want to be observant for any red flags. We want to do what we can to educate ourselves about child sexual abuse, understanding what the signs and symptoms are, so that if we suspect something, if we see something, we are prepared to report it, to make that mandated report a report. We also want to teach children. We want to empower them and teach them how to protect themselves. It's their body. You have a right to say no. If someone touches you in a way that you don't like, saying, I don't like that, and saying, I don't want you to touch me in that way. So we want to teach them how to protect themselves. Make sure they know that they have the right to not let anyone touch them if they don't want to be touched. We also want to do what we can to encourage adults, the caregivers, to be involved in their child's activities. Know who your child is spending time with and how they're spending their time. Know where the child is and who their child is with at all times. Letting children know that they can talk with you about anything. Again, having that unconditional positive regard and reserving judgment. And so letting them know that they can talk to you about anything that makes them uncomfortable, and that if they tell you about abuse, believe them. We also want to do what we can to participate in community efforts at education. So educating the community about child sexual abuse, the signs and symptoms, and about ways that we can intervene and prevent it from happening. We want to do what we can to help strengthen our communities by volunteering with organizations that help to protect children, whether it be Prevent Child Abuse America or your children's advocacy centers. So doing what we can to get involved and to be a part of prevention initiatives. Joining or starting a child abuse prevention coalition in our community. And doing what we can to be a part of public policy and changes in laws that affect our children and families and that are put in place to protect our children. We want to do what we can to make child abuse prevention a priority because we understand that that's what's right, that the child needs a voice. They need someone to advocate and to stand up for them, and that they may not have an advocate in any other capacity. And so if we see something, not saying to ourselves, oh, someone else will do it or someone else will report it, taking that responsibility and understanding our role as mandated reporters to intervene and making that a priority, that it takes all of us to protect children and to do what we can to keep them safe. Do you have any questions? I know it's a lot of information, it's a lot of content. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate again to let me know, to reach out, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. I do look forward to our next class session and continuing our conversation on different traumas that children experience and how we can intercede and intervene and how we can be of support. I hope that you have a beautiful rest of the day and week, and look forward to talking more with you soon.